I am so happy to be here. Thank you for coming. Those who know me for the last 25 years know I'm very emotional and I'm very weepy very quickly. So I feel a little weepy right now because it's actually really meaningful to be here. And I love this place, and walking around here, I'm just flooded with memories. Seeing you is crazy. But seeing old friends and seeing how the place is like thriving and changing, and new community members, and it's a really special place. So it's very moving to me in a really nice way to come back and to be welcomed to come back and to still have a connection after all these times to a place that I really truly love. It's emotional, it's very touching. So I'm very glad to be here, and I thank you. I'm just really happy for this. So I've done all these books. I thought what I would do is tell you a story and kind of set the stage for what this book is about and what it means. It's a story that a lot of Buddhists have some sense of, but most people actually, I'm starting to realize, I wrote something in the introduction where everybody knows, but I think I sometimes you get so into your own material that you're like, everybody knows this, but that is not true. And the people that I actually really was sure know this story really well turned out they didn't. So I thought I could explain to you this story that is really important to a lot of people in the Buddhist world, and tell you about the book. I did an international book launch a couple of weeks ago in Korea. And I launched it there because there was an international meeting of Buddhist nuns. There are 2,500 Buddhist nuns from all over the world that got together. It's a meeting that happens every couple of years. And it was a huge meeting. And sharing this book with them was a very surprising experience. So I thought I could tell you a little bit about how it was received there and some of the comments I got. And then we can move forward from there. There's a lot of directions that this conversation can go. Every time I've presented this book, it surprises me where the conversation goes. I seem to have no control over where it goes. When I used to do book talks on Yashodhara, the conversation almost always went the same way, so I became an expert at it because I just knew where it was going. I could do it off the top of my head without like even thinking about it. This is a very different beast. Every time I've talked about this book, I have been very surprised by the responses and the trail of conversation that it picks up. So I don't seem to have any, I think it does something different to everyone who hears this story. And so we can talk about it in any kind of way that you want to talk about it. But what we were talking about at lunch today is one of my fondest memories at Aryaloka is you would hear a talk, and then we would break out into groups, and then I would argue with whoever ended up in the group. And I would get very invested in those small conversations, and I loved those small conversations. So I thought what would be nice, Amala remembers those very well. I was a terrible pain, and they were very nice to me, is that I can present for a while. You guys are really welcome to interrupt me at any time. Ask me if there's something you don't understand, because Buddhism is so much more complicated than it looks on the outset. And the more you learn about it, the more you get lost really fast. So please interrupt me. I'll clarify as much that is in my ability, and then we can take the conversation wherever it goes, and then we can break up into groups where you guys can follow the threads in whatever way that you want. I'm happy to continue talking, and some people can go off and do the talk. I can join a group, or we can just let you guys go off and do your thing, and then we'll reconvene at the end to kind of see what happened. Is that all right? Yeah, okay. So I've received, like I've had, the material of this book is actually really real life lived, which is why it generates so many, it's not part of, it's not stuck in the ancient past. It's very much a lived experience that Buddhist women are still experiencing and still wrestling with, and Buddhist communities are still wrestling with. And that's part of why this conversation just kind of goes, because sometimes people want to know how it's experienced in this part of the world versus that part of the world, or how do monks respond to it, or like it just goes off. And so it can either stay in ancient storytelling, it could go into doctrine, it can go into monastic law, or it can go into lived experiences, it can go into sexual violence, like it goes into all kinds of domains that surprise me. So that's a lot of the stuff that tends to come out. But there's other kind of questions, just to give you an idea of the things that you can start going, okay, I can see how those are the questions to be asked. Questions about writing these stories as a Westerner, right? Questions of cultural appropriation, of identity politics. Like there's a lot of different ways in which we can just go, hold on, what do I do with all of this? So I invite you to really engage with this in whatever way your brain is going right now. Yeah, and I'm comfortable with what, if I can't do it, I'll let you know, but I'll try to engage with whatever you send my way. So how many of you guys find Buddhist texts complicated? But not like the actual words of the text, but like which texts fit where? Okay, so this is part of the struggle, right? Is that when you first meet Buddhism, you're like, oh, impermanence, Four Noble Truths, I got it, right? That's just like the kind of Wikipedia version of Buddhism. It's true, yeah, Four Noble Truths, impermanent suffering, we got that. But that's just, it's kind of like, it's everything and it's nothing also. Buddhism is also a culture that's been alive and thriving and is diverse for 2,500 years, give or take. Nobody really knows how long, but we just say 2,500 because it's just a safe number. Could be 26, could be longer, we don't know. But basically what we're talking about is a whole civilization that doesn't just come down to the Four Noble Truths, right? It's entire libraries of books, right? There's no, one of the things that's so hard about Buddhism that makes it that the more you get into it, the more you're like, what is this? is that we don't, there's no Bible. There's no Quran.
It's a mess.
It's a mess, right? It's just a fabulous mess. It really, really is. And so instead of a Bible, you get a library. And then you're supposed to engage with the entire thing, right? And you don't like, and it's all different languages. And then how come you can write a Buddhist text that qualifies as sacred scripture 100 years ago, but the Buddha died 2,500 years ago? Like, how does this play out? How do you have a tradition that is still producing sacred texts? Right? And then does that mean that the texts we're producing today may turn into the sacred texts of the future? The answer to that is actually yes, right? Like the notion of sacred scripture in Buddhism is massive. And every community in the Buddhist world produces their own, which is so wild. So it's not as though there's one time and place that says we produce Buddhist text. It's Buddhist text is produced as a part of what it is to be a Buddhist. What Buddhists do is they produce texts, they tell stories, they invent and they recreate in their own language and their own style over and over and over again. So it literally is a ongoing, thriving sacred scripture. And that makes it really hard to figure out. So if you're starting to look at this and you're hearing about different things, you don't know what they are, you're in very good company and you should never be embarrassed about that. And I guarantee 99% of Buddhists are in the exact same boat. Most Buddhist monks I know are in the same boat, like they don't know either. No one really knows. You have to, none of us actually, even if you dedicate your entire career to studying Buddhist texts, you still get surprised all the time of how much more there is, or discovering a whole other pocket and you're like, wow, I've never heard of that before. There's just so much. And so it's a kind of a treasure hunt, and it's really fun, and it's humbling, and it's diverse, and you never quite get a control over it. Like, you never quite manage to get your arms around it because it's so massive. And in the midst of all that writing and producing and the storytelling that happens, there's customs and there's habits and there's local traditions, and there's, so that everywhere you go in the Buddhist world is different and it's varied and it's eclectic. And there's superstitions and there's gods and then it gets like really cleaned up and it's like, it's very, streamlined, and then it pops up again and it gets all colorful. One of the things that I've always loved about this movement is that it's had an ability to engage with some of that. Not always all of it, it gets kind of stuck sometimes, but there's a desire to engage with the colorful, right? That it's not just streamlined, it's just this one thing. So it gets overwhelming really fast, and you're kind of swimming in it, trying to figure out, what am I supposed to read and how am I supposed to do this? In all of that, there are beautiful little nuggets that you just keep discovering because you're never done with it. So when I wrote the first book of Yashodhara, it was to retell the Buddha's life story, pulling pieces together from so many of the texts that I had access to. Kind of, you're like, literally, it's like you're at a buffet That's what I feel like. I'm always at a buffet and I'm overeating, right? And so you've got this huge table of all these texts, and then I just like pour through all of them, and I'm like, oh, that's a good one, and then that's a good one. And you take all these scenes, which is what Buddhists have been doing for 2,500 years. We just all have a different buffet table. So what I have access to in the 21st century is different than what a writer would have had in the Middle Ages. But the writer in the Middle Ages was also kind of going, what do I have access to, and how will I create this story? So the stories are alive. And I think if there's one first thing I want to convey is that there's not a set, rigorous, this is the story of the Buddha's life, or this is, it just, there's no story. There's just an ongoing story. So when I wrote Yashoda and the Buddha, I wanted to write her story, which is the story of the Buddha's wife. And so I was finding all the places, all the scenes where I could find her, and she's all over the place, but we kept forgetting about her. Right? We would tell the Buddhist story as though he lives in a vacuum and he's all by himself and he's just this amazing guy who just figures everything out, and then voila, he's the Buddha, yay, right? It's very, very isolated, and it bugged me that like this whole thing is happening on this like tiny little plane, because when you go to the Buddhist world, his story is huge. And there's gods following him, and there's, you know, serpent deities, and there's like, you know, his cousins are in the forest with him, like the whole family's around. He's throwing miracles left, right, and center. I mean, it's just crazy stories that he's got. He's not sitting all by himself being a reasonable, logical philosopher, but that's how we tell the story. Yeah. And so that's very frustrating, is that the more that I get to know how eclectic and wild this literature is, the more impoverished our versions sound to me. And I think that's no fun. It's like to have a guy just sit down and go, voila, I get it, impermanence. That's just not going to do anything for me. So I get that impermanence is something I have to wrestle with. I don't like it. So that also might be part of it, because I don't like impermanence at all. But if I'm going to have to deal with impermanence, give me a serpent deity or something, right? Like, I mean, just make it better. And they do. Buddhists do. It's the Western Buddhists who suck. Like, we just go, philosophers, if you need, like, sorry, in English, like we just do the philosopher and it's over, right? So when I found her, I was like, oh my goodness, it's actually a love story. And then the whole story changed. I was like, oh my God, this is like a romantic drama. And the whole story changed for me. And I was like imagining these two star-crossed lovers who've been together for generations and lifetimes, and then torn apart as he goes off to become the Buddha. It's fantastic. When you start telling the story like that, it's so much better. And Buddhists have been telling the story like that for 2,500 years. We just haven't been paying attention. There's so many great versions of the Buddhist story where it's a devastating tragedy. It's epic, right? I mean, what was her name who did Cleopatra? Liz Taylor. She should have played, right? Like, I mean, this is, right? Her and what was his name? Richard Burton, right? That's what we needed instead of Cleopatra. So, like, that's the kind of storytelling I found myself engaging with, and I thought, this is so much better than the kind of dried out philosopher version that I've been living with all this time. So that was really exciting, and it made me realize that these stories are much more alive and fully embodied and fleshed and sensual and engage all the self. And that through telling her story of her loss, I learn the tradition without ever having to read philosophy, which is great for me. So I don't have to do the philosophy because I learn it through the story, which is how Buddhists have been learning for 2,500 years. Just tell the story. You'll understand impermanence in a second. So that was really very exciting to kind of process. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that last point about how like learning through the story as like compared to
learning the Four Noble Truths over and over and over again. If you read some of the poetry that has been written in her voice, her sense of loss, her anguish when he leaves her, it's devastating, right? She loved him. She had been with him for generations, for lifetimes, according to the tradition. And then he just walks out going, I'm going to go figure out suffering. She's like, yeah, you just caused suffering. That's right? And so she's left feeling what he's thinking about. And you feel her, and you're like, this is loss, and this I know. I don't need to read the Four Noble Truths. I know what pain feels like. That's it.
Yeah.
Right? So her, in Sri Lanka, they sing her songs at funerals.
Yeah.
You don't need anything else. Right? So we've kind of like looked down on stories a little bit as though this is like what women do or what children want. It's not what great thinkers do. And I'm starting to appreciate the more I write and tell stories that it's all I want. And there's a kind of liberation of realizing stories are just fine. And that they're a lot less isolating sometimes and accessible. And I see the difference in my students' faces. I see the difference every talk I give, that when you tell a story, people react in ways that sometimes just kind of going through the Four Noble Truths is just kind of, you're torturing yourself. Right? But just because you're just going suffering, right? Like it's hard, right? And it's got value. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I think we're losing out when we don't also give ourselves space to just engage with the color. And the sensuality of the tradition. Buddhism is much more sensual than we have it all allowed. I think we've really stripped it down to just kind of a brain in a jar half the time.
Yeah.
Thank you for that answer.
I think that's a shame. So when I finished the Ashoda story, he leaves her. You all know that, like, he goes off and becomes the Buddha, and he wins. And she's left in the palace, the poor thing, it's terrible. So she's left in her palace, she's given birth to their son all by herself, living with her in-laws. I mean, can you think of anything worse?
No.
And then like Indian in-laws, like there's a lot of stories about that. So she's like stuck with the in-laws in India. And she's a widow, right? Because that's what happens, is that when you leave the home, you're not allowed to come back. And so you become a widow. The wife becomes a widow. And there's a tradition that when you leave the home, you should not come back. Right? This is going to be very important for the next story. Yeah.
Leave the home,
When he left her to become the Buddha. So he's married to her, and he decides, I need to go figure my stuff out.
So he left her and she becomes a widow.
She becomes the widow. He's great.
And looked down upon.
Yes, she suffers because she loses all her status.
Right.
This is still true. So you can still become a renunciant in India today, and you become socially dead. So the woman who's left behind becomes a widow.
With all the stigma there.
Sorry?
With all the stigma thereof.
And it comes, well, it's less stigma because she's a renunciant widow than it would be a widow, because the stigma that you get in India is because of bad luck. So if you become a widow, he died too early, you're bad luck. So that's a different stigma then. But still, she's left behind.
Are there instantly, I think of the United States. Our culture is very different, and yet how do we have those widows that when the men run off,
right,
for whatever purpose,
and the women are left behind?
And the women are left behind.
So in that sense, it's very familiar.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's her suffering.
I always think, for instance, my father, but my mother continued as Mrs. long after their divorce.
Wow.
To me, that's that same.
That is that suffering, because her identity is tied to who he is.
Right.
It's not hers.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's still going on. Women still take their husbands' names in the 21st century. Yeah. That's a whole, see, we're going already in another thread, but we're not doing it. So I just went there and I was like, oh, I have so, now I'm upset. But
Suffering.
see, all you need is a story. You get it. I don't need to give you the Four Noble Truths. All right, I'm going to be more serious. So he leaves. He becomes the Buddha. The next story, which is the next book, is that one day the women. So what happens to him is that he goes off into the forest and he becomes the Buddha. And it takes quite a few years, but he eventually figures it out. He achieves this thing called awakening, and the men show up and they're like, oh, we want to learn from you. And so suddenly all the family members he left show up. So this is another idea that's really important for us to kind of disentangle, is that we've, I think, adopted a very strong idea of renunciation. We think that renunciation means you never talk to your family, like it's like very extreme. But the Buddhist story is not extreme at all. He becomes a renunciant. He leaves her, but that happens all the time. But then all the family comes to join him in the forest. And so now he's surrounded by his family again, but they're all as monks. And so the men have, and so when you look at the list of the early monks, it's just, I mean, who else is going to join him? right? These are the people he knows. This is the people who know him, who trust him. And so when he achieves this, the men are like, oh, I want to go sit with him and figure this out too. So he's surrounded by his community. He's never on his own, right? And so he's surrounded by this community of men. And every time a man shows up and says, I would like to learn what you're teaching, he says the same thing in the literature, in the earliest strata of the literature that we have with this. And I'm going to be evasive because if I give you text names, it's going to bug you. So, but the earliest strata, he says one thing. He says, come. That's it. Come and sit next to me, like it's finished. That's the entire process in the early tradition of becoming a monk, right? It's just, oh, I'd like to learn. I mean, with the Buddha, later it gets more complicated. Just, I'd like to study with you. And he says, come. So slowly he grows a community around him and people are practicing together and they're having a sangha like this and they're living in the forest and they're, having little things that come up every once in a while and they're like, oh, what do we do with this situation? What do we do with that situation? And they're working themselves out and they're growing as a community. And so slowly a sangha is growing around him in the forest. Lovely. The Buddha has a stepmother. So if you don't know his life story super well, when he's born, his mother dies right away. So he experiences suffering right from the get-go. And then it's her sister who raises him. So her name is Mahabhajapati Gotami. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll just say Gotami, it'll be easier. So Gotami raises him, she raises her nephew, and she becomes the new queen. So the king, depending on the version of the story you read, he married his sisters. And so there was the head queen, which was the oldest sister. She dies, so then Gotami is up next. And so she's the new queen. And she's gonna raise her sister's son as her own. And so she's the stepmother and the aunt. So y'all got that. And so she raises the person who's gonna become the Buddha for his whole youth. And she cares for him and and the literature is really quite clear about this and very tender about like that she holds him and she makes sure he's nursed. She doesn't nurse him, they had wet nurses, but she's feeding him and she's holding him and she's caring for him night and day, right? And so she's the mom. And so she's done all this for him and sacrificed herself this way for him. And then he leaves, he doesn't look back, and she doesn't get in the way of that. And then her husband dies, so she takes care of the king until he dies. She fulfills all of her obligations that a woman of her time and place would have had to fulfill. And so she does all of this. And after her husband dies and everything's finished, now she's a widow in a palace. She's of no use anymore. The next generation is gonna take over. Like she's just sitting there. And so she thinks, well, maybe I'll just go to the forest and join them. Which is a really ballsy thing to do because there were no women out there. And she just decides, sorry, I've got a potty mouth. I just realized I said that. I really should try to curtail it, but I've never been able to.
I thought it was funny.
Okay, good. I actually told myself in the car on the way over, don't swear. It's gonna happen. So she does everything that she needs to do, and then she is ready to go. And there's different versions of how this happens. So we get this story. So there's something called the Vinaya, which you guys may have already heard that word floating about. It's really complicated because there's 6 of them. So that confuses things because Buddhists started disagreeing with each other right off the bat, and they all broke up into pieces and they all rewrote their Vinayas in their own way. So we were told there were 18 of these. We only have 6 that have remained. They're all different. Vinayas are the rules that Buddhist monks and nuns have to follow. So it's basically a rule book for the monks, but it's 7 volumes long. And it's because it includes all the stories before. It's wonderful literature, so that you get the story of who screwed up what, and then, okay, time to start a new rule, which is how this place functions too. There was a lot more rules now than there were 25 years ago. But now we're like, oh, that shouldn't have done that, so now new rule. So it's the same thing. A living society always does this. As a situation arises, new rule. So the Vinaya works that way. So you get these wonderful stories in the Vinaya before the rules or after the rules. So it's great literature, but it's really complicated, and I don't recommend diving in unless you're sure you're up for it, because you'll get confused very fast. But once you get comfortable, it's worth spending some time with. So in this Vinaya, we get this story of Gautami leaving home and arriving to ask the Buddha, I want to join. And all 6 Vinayas tell the same story, but they're a little bit different in the wording. So the fact that it's in all of them is important for us because it means, okay, this is really a standard story. This is something that the earliest tradition preserved, right? It's not like an anomaly and tucked away somewhere. And so in all of them, she approaches the Buddha. He's sitting in a forest with his monks, who've all been told, I'll just remind you, come. And so she approaches him, the woman who raised him, and she says to him, Bhante, it would be nice if we could join the community too. Can we have permission? And all 6 Vinayas, he gives us a non-answer. He doesn't say no, he doesn't say yes. He says some version of, because they're all a little bit different, maybe don't ask the question. What the hell does that mean? So she's standing there, and according to the Vinaya, she has hundreds of women with her. So all these women have left their homes and have walked behind Gautami to make this request. So in my imagination, this is the first Women's March. 2,500 years ago, women marched out of their homes and asked, can we be let in the door? And the answer they get is, I don't know what to tell you. Or your question's not helping me, or something, but not, of course you can. And also not no, just, I'd rather you didn't ask me this question. So she asks a second time. Now in India, there's a rule that still stands, that if somebody serves you food, and I said this when I was in Korea, and a bunch of Indian women came running at me afterwards going, it's true about the rice. They were so excited I gave this example, is that if you're like eating somewhere and somebody serves you rice and you say no, they say, okay, they come back 2 seconds later, they try again, give you rice, and you go, no, I don't want. They're gonna come a third time. If you say no on the third time, it's because you meant it. But usually the first 2 are like, no, I don't wanna get fat, right? Okay, fine, I'll eat more. That's how it goes, right? But if you say no on the third time, they're not coming back and forth, right? So she asks 3 times, Bhante, would you let us into the community? And 3 times he says, don't ask me this question. She's not allowed to ask a 4th. And according to the Vinaya, this is in front of all the monks. I mean, we have seen this story play out.
Yeah.
These women standing there vulnerable, just saying, please let me in. And then in front of all the men saying, I don't really want to. And so now remember I told you before, renunciant, when you leave home, you don't come back. She has left home. They all have. So now what do they do? And he knows this. He has completely stranded them because if he doesn't take them, they have nowhere to go because they can't go home. You can't say, I'm gonna shave my head, become a monk. You go out 5 minutes and then you're like, wow, that was really tough. I'm coming back home. You're not allowed to do that, right? So, you can't. So, and I mean, today monks will renounce the robes, right? Like it happens, people do this all the time now, but we're living in a very different time where everything is kind of too temporal and world is very different in terms of our relationship to vows, to what it was before. But certainly in ancient India and certainly in the early literature that we have, these vows are permanent. And so if you leave home, you don't come back. And there's all these like texts that like try to scare you, like somebody who renounces and then goes back home because they found it too hard will be reborn as like a cockroach for 60,000 years or something. Like they try to scare you with this. Like if you're gonna do this, be serious because you're not coming back. And these women left home. And he said, I'd rather not. So one of the reactions I've gotten at from this book is extraordinary rage, which I didn't see, but I got that one. I was like, I am so mad since I read your book. I was like, oh, shit. now you have to really look for the details, right? This is like, you gotta go find stuff, because otherwise you just go with the same story, it's not gonna work. So I'm like looking at these texts over and over again, and I'm trying to find something, and come across one detail that was really bizarre, is that she leaves, and two things that we haven't really made a fuss over. One is she just follows him to the next town, and she asks the fourth time. She just goes again. But the rule is 3. And she asks the fourth time. So when he says no 3 times, what we haven't made a fuss on is that she asked the fourth. And I think it's because we haven't registered that. But she goes, and she's like, well, he leaves, and he goes off to his next town, and she's standing there. And so she picks up the women, and she says, well, let's just go to Vaishali. That's where we're going now. We're gonna follow him to the next town, and we're just gonna ask again. You're not supposed to do that. But if women always did what they were supposed to do, we would never do anything. Right. So 2,500 years ago. So she does that, but here's the detail that really threw me. Oh yes, you're saying it, I can hear it in my head. The detail that I found is that when she arrives in Vaishali, or Vaishali, Ananda comes out and he sees the women standing there. And the text says, the early text, the Pali Vinaya, that he sees Gautami and all the women standing there with tear-stained faces and dusty robes and shaved heads. When did she shave her head? Because it doesn't say that over there. Now maybe she showed up with a shaved head, but she didn't have permission yet to shave her head. So something's funny here.
Leap of faith.
Oh, that's not a leap of faith. That is like, to hell with you, I'm shaving my head and I'm coming. That's what that is. She shaved her head. And yes, which is shocking to have such an important female figure be defiant of the Buddha in these texts, right? But I think that's a way of reading. Now, you could probably read it a different way. We don't have to read it this way. But I think you can certainly interpret it as an act of defiance, because suddenly all the women have come for the 4th time, are standing in front of all the monks. Like how could you make them more uncomfortable? Right? Like all the monks are sitting here in their beautiful grove meditating, and all the women just show up with bald heads going,
hairy eyeball.
Right? Like how uncomfortable can you make them? Like it's perfect. Like it's the best strategy. It's the oldest strategy in the world. And that's what they did. And so they show up and stand there and they wait. And the Buddha doesn't come to see them. Ananda does. And so Ananda sees the tear-stained faces and the robes, and he's like, what are you doing here? And she says, well, we've come to ask for ordination. He's like, but he said no. And she's like, well, here we are. And so Ananda goes in to negotiate with the Buddha, which bugs me, that now it's a negotiation between men about women, which also we have seen 100 times over. But the men go close themselves off in a room, and the negotiation begins, and Ananda fights for the women. And he asks the Buddha all the right questions that make it that the Buddha will finally say yes. Now, is the question then we all have wrestled with is, does he say yes because he's pressured? Does he say yes because he feels guilty? Like, we don't know. And people have a lot of feelings about why he said yes. But what we have at the end of it, and it's problematic, because if you want to have a perfectly awakened Buddha, he can't be subject to guilt or, social pressures, or right. But then he should have said yes the first time. But so we have a problem here, a doctrinal problem, a faith problem. We have a problem. But the story is held in these texts that are really important to the tradition, where Ananda goes to see him and he asks him first, can women achieve awakening? Which is brilliant. And the Buddha goes, well, yeah, they can. So good. And he's like, well, then what? You want to explain this to me? And he says in the text, and he takes a risk, because he says, then why is it that Gautami, the one who raised you, who took care of you, and he lists it, the woman who did all those things for you, Why is she out there and not ordained? And then he says, okay, they can be ordained. And so that's why we have this question, was it guilt? Is it family ties? Like, what is it that made him say yes? And every answer we give is the wrong answer because it creates a doctrinal problem, because you don't want to have a Buddha that is going to succumb to that. So this has been actually a really thorny place for the tradition, is why did the Buddha say yes, and how do we deal with, this is the context. And why did he say no? And then comes the doozy. I'm really sorry I'm going to introduce you to this, but you might as well learn it. So he says, okay, they can be ordained, but, and he issues a very famous set of rules that become part of the Vinaya. They're called the Garu Dharmas, and Garu means heavy. There's some debate about whether it's translated as heavy. Only one person thinks otherwise, but everybody else thinks it's Garu, meaning heavy. The heavy dharmas, the heavy teachings, the heavy rules. And the 8 rules, women have to remember, monks got come. Women get no 3 times, 4th time maybe, but not to your face, and then the Garu Dharmas. And the Garu Dharmas are, so before I tell you the Garu Dharmas, everything in Buddhism, despite how we practice it in the West, is hierarchy. Hierarchy and lineage is everything in every Buddhist country. Who comes first, right? Like if Shuddhaya was ordained on Monday and Singasuri was ordained on Tuesday, he's her superior, period. That's how it goes. He's, right? So in a Buddhist country, he would be sitting. I'm sorry, I should have done the other way around. I should have.
Right.
You should have done it.
I did, I know.
He looks very red on Zoom.
He's like, I am her superior. Yeah, she'll never let that. But anyway, so when you sit in a shrine room in any Buddhist country, it goes by order of ordination, right? So it's the most senior, and then it's going to be, well, men and women and lay people, right? Like, but it's all ordered, and people memorize their order. So when you when monks meet each other, one of the questions you're going to ask is, how long have you been ordained? So that you qualify who's senior. And part of it is also your language. In a lot of Buddhist countries, you address people in a different way if they're your elder or they're your younger sibling, right? So one of the first things you do is try to figure out who's older and who's younger. So when I go to Nepal, that's like the first, and if they don't ask, I go to Nepal often, how old I am, which now they don't know if they're allowed. But then if they call me Mata, then I'm not even an older sibling. Now I'm the mother, I'm gonna hit them, right? Like, but it's just, right? So I'm just like, so to be safe, I get called older sister all the time, but then, somebody, and then you're not sure. So you're always kind of trying to find a polite way to figure out in your relationships who fits where, and then your language changes. And so everything is built around this structure of hierarchy. And the tradition is built around the hierarchy, right? So no matter how much we try to democratize it and create committees and everything else, it's not in kind of organic to how the tradition was imagined. And it's not how it's practiced in most parts of the world. And so when that tries to happen here, you should know it's quite rebellious and revolutionary, and it takes a lot of practice and adjustment to figure out how to do it well. I lost my train of thought. I just went to the siblings and then
The heavy teachings.
So, first Garu Dhamma is, you guys were all listening really well, that was very immersive, because I got lost in my head. The first one is that if a monk has been ordained one day, and a nun has been ordained 100 years, I don't even need to
Say no more. Right.
That is the first rule, is that no matter what, a nun is always inferior to a monk, period.
Terrific.
And these are the rules that are still being negotiated in Buddhist countries all over the world, which is why this story is alive, which is why I wanted to launch this book in a place where people are living with this story in a very real-time way. Rule number 2, or what, I don't remember the order of them, but basically, monks have to give instruction to nuns, but nuns do not give instruction to monks. And nuns have to do their confessions to monks, but monks do not confess to nuns, right? So it's just like one scenario after another. that basically locks them into inferiority so that they always understand they're at the back of the bus. If they can accept that, then they get ordination. Which again, so I can remind you, when the men arrived, he said, come. But the women get this whole gymnastics. So Gautami is very strategic, and I think she has been underestimated for all of these reasons, from shaving her head secretly to asking the fourth time to the next part. And the next part is, and I didn't put this in the book, but it's in my notes because I stopped it at one point, is that after he does this, she does what women have done 1,000 times. She says, sure, okay, I'll accept your rules. You know, strategy, this is how I get in the door, I'll get in the door, fine. And so she gets ordained, and then the second she's ordained, she says, Bante, could we negotiate the first rule? Which is all the evidence anyone needs. She didn't like this. She didn't go, I'll take anything.
Yeah.
Everything you say is amazing. You're the Buddha and everything you do just blows my mind. She's like, fine, have it that way. Now let's change the rule. Now that I'm ordained and I'm in the system, change the rule, which is what women have been doing forever. Get in the door, get in the system, then blow it up, right? Like, because doing it from the outside doesn't work. So she does that, and she makes her request, and the text preserves that she asked that. So just as you're getting mad at Buddhism for all of this, remember, these Buddhist texts are produced by men, preserved by men, and they kept this story. And I think that's genius. And so she asks, and he gives an answer that's not some kind of fantastic, awakened, insightful anything. He says, I don't think the neighbors would like it if they saw monks bowing to nuns. Not quite like that, but you get it, right? So no. And the answer is because it's not going to work socially. We can't afford it.
She doesn't stop though, does she?
She does. I mean, she does and she doesn't, but she becomes ordained and she lives her community. We don't get many details after that, but what we do get, so the story after that kind of ends. So we don't know what the nuns, how their lives were, what they lived like, what happened. But what we do have, and this is where you're supposed to get excited about Buddhism again, is we do have a text that was by my side the whole time I wrote this book. And it's the Therigatha, which we talked about when we were eating lunch today. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of literature, I think, in the world, honestly, and I think certainly of Buddhism. And it's certainly gotten a lot more attention in the last few years. So I'm very happy about that. So in this massive corpus of Buddhist writing that's almost always addressed to men and is about men, we have this, and that's true of all world literature, almost always. But we have this one little book of poems that's about 2,000 years old that belongs to the early Buddhist Pali canons, the early library of Buddhism, preserved this book and passed it on generation after generation so that we still have it, which all of this should give you some sense of awe that this androcentric world preserved and protected this text. And this text, we think, was actually written by women, not in somebody else's voice, like somebody else taking on their voices. It's 73 poems that really do, we have no reason to disbelieve this text at this point. That it's about 2,000 years old, and it's the poems of the first Buddhist nuns. And it really does read like women writing it, because they bitch. And then they're set free. They are heroic, extraordinary women. And so each poem is a poem of a different nun that we think may have been, so we think this is the oldest literature of women produced by women in the world, right? Like we'll have like 3 verses of the Hebrew Bible that we ascribe to the prophetess Miriam. If you know anything about the Hebrew Bible, we think that might have actually been like verses of a female prophetess. It's possible, but that's like it. It's like 3 verses in the Hebrew Bible. We don't have anything like this anywhere, like an entire book, not 3 verses, that we think actually were women's voices. And it's poem after poem of different nuns telling their stories And their stories are raw and they're real and they're in fragments. So you get a commentary that came later, but that tells you the stories that explain some of the verses. So it's really great to read with the commentary. And so the commentary gives you the backstory of what she's referring to when she says X, Y, or Z. And when you read the two together, you have real women's stories. And it's one woman after another saying, you know, some terrible stories. My husband was beating me and I escaped. And then I found the Sangha and I became free. Or I was a princess and I was bored and all my friends became nuns. That's my favorite. That's why I'm like, that was definitely written by a woman. And she was like, so I left and I became a nun, but it worked out. And so she, right? But then you have, that's really in there. One of the most touching is this homeless widow who lives by the side of the road. And she doesn't even have any aspirations. So that's when you're like, this is honest. It's not like I believe in the Buddha and I want awakening. They're just like, I gotta get out of this house. Or this Chandra, who's this homeless widow, she sees the nuns walking by and she grabs at them and she says, if I go with you, will you take care of me? Will I be able to eat? And Patachara, if you know who she is, she's the one who responds to her and she says, yes, come with us. She's just hungry, she needs somewhere to go, which is what half of our sanghas are about anyway, right? It's just come, we'll take care of you, right? And she became free, right? And there's another woman who's like putting a noose over her neck because she can't take her life anymore. And then she understands the teaching and she puts it away and she becomes free. And so each poem, one after another, some of them are really heart-wrenching, some are wonderful and inspiring. Like they're all very different. They're very real, they're very raw, and they're unapologetic about their accomplishments. Where one woman after another says, not maybe I achieved something, but don't worry about it, I'm sure he knows more than I do. It's just, I did this, I accomplished it, I know it, I am free. And to read women say that 2,000 years ago, and half the time we can't say it today, it's very moving. And so I had that book with the Vinaya with me as I wrote this, because I thought I want the power of these women and their uncompromising accomplishment combined with the reality of the world they were met with. And so you can see this conversation can go in 50 different directions. Do you guys need a minute? I feel like you need a minute. How are we doing?
Keep talking.
Does anybody have any questions you guys want to, or I could tell you next parts, yeah.
So why do you think the men did save these wonderful poems? That seems really, you think they'd be like,
I don't think all men are the same. And I think there's great teachers always, and there are conditions always, and there's horrible people always. And I think that's just always been true and it will always be true. And just as there's going to be horrible systems put in place to keep certain people down systematically, those systems are real. It doesn't mean that every individual buys into it. Unfortunately, those poems didn't travel well. So the Pali Vinaya went to China, and then from China went to Korea and Japan. Like Buddhism moves, and so they pulled their libraries and moved with them, and then recopied them and translated them. The Therigatha did not, so it didn't go anywhere. We don't have it in any other language except for Pali, but we also don't have the poems of the monks because we have a similar collection of poems of their first monks, and that. So I don't think it's specific to the nuns. These poems didn't seem to go anywhere, so we really have just kind of rediscovered them in a sense in the last few decades and realizing what a treasure trove they are. And I do think it's important that I think it's probably a male institution that preserved them. And I have to remind myself that, and I want to remind readers of that. And I felt that way. That was like my first revelation when I was writing Yashodhara, is when I saw all of these beautiful poems that spoke of her heartbreak. I realized I was reading poems written by men. And that was like a connect in my head of just, wait a minute, men wrote this. They didn't have to. They could have just been, the Buddha left home, he was done with her, she's irrelevant now, and just follow him in the forest, but they don't. They stop their storytelling to go, look at how sad she was. That to me is really important. They gave her time, and They kept these stories, and women did get ordination, but like by tooth and nail. So depending on the lens you use, you see it very differently at different times, but it's still very painful because it means 2,500 years later, we're still, women are still like, oh my God, let us in the door, right? That's the rage part that I was met with recently that surprised me. Just, this has been going on for 2,500, like we really still are doing the same system.
Oh, yeah. But we still don't have the ERA in this country,
The ERA,
Equal Rights Amendment for women.
what do you mean?
They haven't been able to pass it in Congress.
It has to pass state by state.
And that doesn't pass?
It has
No,
not passed.
No, in this country.
Okay, it just gave me anxiety, sorry.
Yeah.
So some things change and some
Nothing
do
has
not.
So Vanessa lives in Canada.
Yeah, I'm
Right.
Canadian.
She doesn't have this
Canadian.
knowledge. Take a minute.
Back that up.
Right, you're safe, not so much.
Yeah.
No, nobody does. Yeah.
Want to get away from US politics?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Oh,
Joe, go ahead.
Oh yeah, Joe, go ahead and ask your question.
You're muted.
I was well, let me say this first. I'm very, 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 very new. So and I just finished Sangharakshita's book, and anyone can correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but there was a part that when you get to a certain part of enlightenment that you can't tell the difference between anything. Like you wouldn't see the difference between like an animal and a house. So when you first started asking this story, my first thought was that an enlightened person, especially the Buddha, wouldn't even see the difference between gender. Is that something?
So I would just say, it's not that he wouldn't see, because then you have basically a blind Buddha bumping into walls. So he would have to be able to see a house and have to see, right? Like it's not, I think you might be taking a little bit literally, but I do think that you're picking up on a really important problem, that you're catching the problem that Buddhism has with this, is that if he's awakened, he must see deeply with love and equality, and not get stuck at conventions that the rest of us get stuck at, right? So that's the problem with these stories for us, is why would the Buddha bow to those conventions? Why would he keep that hierarchy alive? And I don't have an answer for you. I think you're asking the question that Buddhists have been wrestling with, and Buddhist women have been wrestling with for a very long time. That's the problem, right? Is that we would love to have this kind of idyllic story of the Buddha, but the more you look at the Buddhist story, the more messy it gets. It's not.
You could be very pragmatic.
Well, and by being pragmatic, you keep a system of injustice, because that's the only way you're going to get your donations.
Yeah, exactly.
When you had said, in a sense, that one of his responses back was, it wouldn't look good to our neighbors seeing us do this. It was his pragmatism saying, if I want to grow the Sangha, to grow the actual
It's not
Buddhism,
going to work if women are.
it's not going to work if they're looking at us, laughing at us, ridiculing us, and then we'll become ruptured, fractured, and fall apart.
But then the heartbreak is, if the Buddha can't even fight social convention.
Then who can?
Right.
Yeah.
And this is where we all get stuck and go, what do I do with this?
Correct.
And I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And it's hard to justify, from my point of view, what? How could he be enlightened and do that crap?
That's where.
Well, that's why it raises questions for us as to what are we expecting? What do we understand a Buddha to be? What do we think awakening is? All those questions come out of this story when you look at it from this perspective, but probably wasn't so much a question in a context where everybody thought it was fine that women should not be equal, right? So it's very challenging. It's a really challenging story, and I can't clean it for you.
We don't need it.
So we know that the early Buddhist community was unconventional, at least in one extremely important way, in that the Buddha did not recognize caste.
But yet he did.
So this is a question.
Okay.
So So I'm asking you as a scholar, like this is what the idea I have about the early Buddhist community is the Buddha was anti-caste. That is how I've come to understand it. There were rules, there were conditions. He would kind of scold in an enlightened way if he saw someone who used to be a Brahmin treating someone who was of a lower caste in a poor way within the monastic order. So there's that. He was willing to challenge things in that way, and challenge the social order. And am I right in thinking that he was the only teacher at that time who actually did ordain women? No? There were other traditions?
Okay, so which one first?
First one first.
Okay, caste was a narrative that we had for a long time of how we engaged with Buddhism in the West. We did say that a lot. It was quite a prevalent worldview. There's so much to that one.
What do you mean, caste was a common, what about caste?
That Buddhism rejected caste.
Ah.
That was a really common Western interpretation of the tradition.
Yeah.
And there are suttas, there are passages where he plays with it, right? Where like somebody says, oh, I am a high caste, I'm a Brahmin, therefore I will do X, Y, Z. And he's like, what is a Brahmin? A Brahmin is someone who fulfills the precepts, or he does something like that, right? So he plays with the idea. That doesn't mean he's anti-caste. He's being a good thinker, right? He's playing with his worldview and kind of challenging his audience. He's never specifically anti-caste. He's just playing with ideas that he doesn't think, or he thinks the guy's an idiot, and he's like trying to show him that he's being an idiot about something. He probably allowed for more caste intermingling than most communities would have had, but narratives of untouchables or low caste in the community are very few and far between. In part because he was a high caste, and so all the people, so when I said his family and his friends are joining him in the forest, they're all high caste, and so you have a network of people that are all high caste. So the early Buddhist community was basically high caste people, royals, cousins of the royals, like you have a very prestigious elite community shaving their heads, which is a little bit like Western non-Asian Buddhism, right? Like, right? Asian American Buddhism is different, but the non-Asian American Buddhism, North American Buddhism is pretty similar. It was the communities who had the freedom and the space and the time to say, Ila, right? So it's not, the anti-caste I think was overdone. We also have to, so he did let in, so one low caste that he brought into the community was a Pali who was a barber. And he should have been one of the people honored at the first council, and he wasn't. And so there are questions, we don't know why, but it may be that they would have accepted that. So again, is it that he's bowing to pressure, nobody wants the barber to participate in the first council, or is it that he didn't want it? Like it's the same problem that we get with the women. Is he being practical, or is he also bowing to the realities of his time? But I don't know that there's a very explicit anti-caste statement. So I think we got excited about that. I think also, okay, I'm going to say something.
You can tell from your.
The
tension mounts.
Well, I want to do it delicately, but I do think that when we engage with Buddhism in the West, there was something about it. There's a kind of underlying racist thing that in India they have caste, we don't do that.
Right.
Right, we're above that. We don't, so India is like this, but we don't. And superstition, like we kind of got rid of all the things that we decide is like lower.
Yeah.
Right? And so anything associated with India or Buddhist culture or the stories or the color or the rituals is all superstition, it's barbaric. We're going to go to the pure philosophy because we're above it all. And we eliminate it. And I think caste kind of snuck in there a little bit, but I don't know how real it is. I don't know that he like celebrated caste, but I don't think he was anti-caste. I don't have any evidence that he's anti-caste. And I think it was a way for us to define ourselves as like, we are better than, you know what I mean? I think there's that underlying there that we
Yeah.
did unconsciously, but I think that we did.
Except you could argue that we actually do have caste in
Mhm.
our.
I know,
Yeah.
but we nevertheless tell ourselves we don't have caste, they do, we're better.
Right.
So we didn't take all the ugly stuff of India, we took the sophisticated parts.
I think that, hopefully that's changing, I think in the
I think it is
19th
changing.
In the 19th century, absolutely that's true.
Yeah.
In the whole English empire in India,
Mhm.
that's all.
Yeah.
Caste.
Yeah.
Classism.
Absolutely. So I think
Imported
it's
lock,
starting
stock,
to
and
like,
barrel to the early translations and all of it.
but I think we adopted it even like in the 60s and 70s,
Yep.
you know, it's pure Buddhism, we're just gonna meditate and we're just gonna think about deep thoughts. And we got rid of all the sensuality of the tradition, right? We were like, I don't need all that stuff. But that stuff is what makes Buddhism alive in Buddhist
Well, and you got
countries.
Sangharakshita thrown out of the English society, of Buddhist society, it got him thrown out because he was into
Yeah.
being a little wild.
I think that was one of the things that he understood that
Yeah.
got lost. And so we just kept stripping away and we had a lot of judgment with it and patting ourselves on the back. And
Here's another Zoom question from Satya. Satya, what is it?
Yeah, I have a quick question. So in Triratna, we have equal ordination for men and women. But I was quite intrigued about what you said, that you went to South Korea to introduce your book because there was a different experience there. And I was wondering if you were planning to say a little more about that.
yeah, I can tell you a little bit about that, and then maybe it'll be a good time for you guys to break off into groups to kind of figure out which direction you want to go with all of this material. So Amala knows this community quite well. It's an international organization that was established about 30 years ago to give Buddhist nuns in all over the world access to each other. Because Buddhist nuns live a very difficult life and they live with these rules, and they, in a lot of Buddhist countries, are quite oppressed or suffer in all kinds of ways and are quite invisible. And so this organization was created to say, let's get them to network so that, you know, you can meet each other and you can develop ideas and just make the world bigger and see what happens. And for the women who want to get ordination, which is a separate question, but ordination doesn't happen for women all over the Buddhist world. There are many parts of the world for different reasons where women cannot get ordained. And so they can become semi-nuns, but they're not really nuns. So it's like a woman in this community would do all the training and all the practice and all the teachings and everything, but she can't actually get ordained. This is the situation in half the Buddhist world. That's a separate problem from the Gaudharmas. Like there's so many things going on for Buddhist women around the world. So this organization was created to support the women who want to fight for ordination, who want to network with each other. It's an amazing thing. And so I've been going to these meetings as a scholar to just witness these interactions over the years. And so then I was invited to launch the book at this meeting in July. And it was huge. It was 2,500 bald heads stadium, basically. All women. I don't think I've ever been in a room with so many women in my life. It was kind of overwhelming. And then you forget that men exist for a while. Very bizarre, right? Like you're just engulfed in women land for days and days and days. It was nuts. And they cooked because women, right? So they just 3 times a day, every day, these nuns cooked, like the ones who were hosting the South Korean contingent, cooked for us, all 2,500 of us, 3 times a day, fresh, beautiful, vegetarian, delicious food, 3 times a day at the temple. Then you go to the stadium, then you go back to the temple. It was incredible. And like set up tables with tablecloths, like under tents, you know, where you're lined up, like, you know, we're like cattle just lining up rows of women eating and then other women coming to take your place. But I've never seen anything like it. I mean, Koreans, they win. Never would have worked out in India quite the same way. They were very organized. So that was just impressive. And all the women from India were like, so that was funny. But, you know, you had these women from all over the world getting to spend time with each other, which is very moving. And what they did for this event is, so you're on a stage in front of all 2,500 women, and they organized a session where it was going to be 3 women from Bhutan. So in the Himalayas, so where the Dalai Lama rules, Women have never had ordination, just so you understand a little bit of how messy it is out there. And he's basically played the Buddha's game. He's avoided it for strategic reasons. He's in exile, blah, blah, blah. He's never put his head out for this one. And so women have been begging him for decades, would you please allow the ordination to happen? He has never done it. It's hemmed and hawed, and I understand and I'm compassionate, but he's never actually done it. So women in the Himalayas, Bhutan, Nepal, India, the Himalayan traditions, they've actually never had ordination. It never even came there and got lost. It just never existed. Whereas in other places, they had it and they lost it. In the Himalayas, they never had it. It never traveled. And Bhutan is its own kingdom. And I was there a couple of years ago. It's an amazing little place in the Himalayas. And there's a king, and he basically just decides how things go and it happens, which is wild. And he just said, it's enough. And so the king of Bhutan said, we're going to do an ordination for nuns. And the head abbot of the order agreed. And they went against the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa. Like they just said, we're doing it anyway, to hell with it. And they ordained last year 153 Bhutanese women.
Yay.
And so 3 of those women was on the stage with me. And so they started the conversation and they talked about what it felt like and what the process was. And one of the women said, and this woman I've actually known for quite a while, she was wicked, she was brilliant. She said that she got tons of like death threats and angry emails and all kinds of hate mail, and she didn't open a single one. She's like, forward. And then after the ordination, she decided she would look at it. She wouldn't look at it until the ordination was finished because it would freak her out. And so they did it. And it was very emotional to listen to these 3 women who could do this in English talk to us about the feeling of it and all the things that went into it. And then one of them said, it looked like a miracle, but it wasn't a miracle. Like we fought for years for this, which I thought, God, that's the story. Over and over and over again. It's not a miracle when it happens. And so they told their story. And then there was a Cambodian woman who's not a nun, but who's been begging her community to recognize ordination because Cambodians had ordination, they lost it. And so she's been fighting the monks in her area, desperately trying to get them to change their minds. So now they refuse to talk to her. So she started a YouTube channel and she argues with them on YouTube. I was like, who is this person? I was listening to her, I was sitting on the stage going, what are you? She's just like not stopping. And so everything they try to stop her, she's like, to hell with that. And she goes and does, she just keeps going. I'm like, they're gonna kill you. Like literally, that could happen. And she's just like, I don't care, this has to change. So it was very emotional to hear living women talk about them fighting the system. And then it was somebody interviewing me about the book on the stage about talking about, well, we were doing this 2,500 years ago. And I was going to just do something brief on the stage, and then the interviewer was supposed to ask me questions that they had already set up. And then I said in my statement on the stage, I said, well, I don't need to tell you guys the story because they're all living it, right? So I figured we can skip that part. And then I looked at the audience and I went, but I'm gonna tell you the story anyway. And I spent about 20 minutes doing what I did here, and I told the story. And it was very emotional to do in that room with women from all over the world. And I wasn't sure what was gonna happen, but I told them about Chandra, the one who was begging on the side of the road, and that she didn't have any aspirations, she just wanted to be fed. And I saw so many women in the room going like this. And like at different points, I just saw them shaking their heads going, yes, I know this, yes, I know this, yes, I know this. It was so familiar to them. And so I told the story, and you could hear a pin drop in the room of 2,500 women, like they just sat there and listened. And then at the end, then there was questions, and the interviewer asked me, so you broke barriers by writing these books. I'm not, as a scholar, you're not supposed to write like this. And so she kind of brought me into it, like you're also breaking, I'm not really. But she said, what would you say to people about breaking the glass ceiling? And I said, the person who did it was the queen. Like, I don't want Chandra by the side of the road to take the hit for this, right? The reason it happened in Bhutan is because the king said, on opening the door. We can't ask the disenfranchised to do the fight for you. We do need the policy makers to make the policy. It's not fair to ask the little people to risk their lives because they won't make it. So I think, but if you're in a position of power, I think you should. So I thought, remembering that she was a queen that did this. It ended, and I thought that was a really weird thing to end on. It was like, I just ended on like queens should be. Like, I don't know if that's the right message to end on. It's like, if you're not a queen, don't bother. So that weirded me out for a bit. I was like, was that the right note to end this meeting on? But then I finished, and everybody gets up, and it was astounding clapping, and then I couldn't even get off the stage. They were grabbing me at the stage, and they were just the amount of thank yous, and the thank yous that I got that I did not expect at all was, thank you for telling me the story. Because what they live with is the repercussions of it. Yeah. But to have a woman stand on the stage and say, look how powerful these women were, was so emotional to them. And one of the Indian women said, she asked a fourth time. I was like, she asked a fourth time. She was like, I didn't, like, she's so much stronger than I thought. And so it was just a very emotional thing. And I work in the academy where we're constantly terrified of identity politics and who's allowed to say what and who's going to be wrong about what. And I worried about that to no end with these books. And I was met with none of it. Like, I thought somebody was going to say, you're not a nun, you should be writing our story. And instead it was like, thank you for paying attention to us and making the story accessible so I can, because Buddhist texts are complicated for them too. So they've got their prayer books, just like we have that here. And how much of this stuff can you invest in? You're busy, even nuns. So for somebody to sit down and go, let me tell you the story, they had never had that before. And I didn't know that they did not have that before. So that was very emotional, and it was very moving. And I was grabbed at for the next 5 days by bald women. And I'm on every nun's phone now. I was like, selfie. I was like, okay. They're really into their phones and their selfies. But I thought you would want to know that part of the story. And now I'm definitely going to stop talking, and I will let you guys process amongst yourselves.
Thank you.
Listen to you.